Ex-husband hands me divorce papers, thinking he'll get the house, but he has no idea what's coming. When the new two-family house was finally finished, my mother-in-law looked at me with a cold smile and said, "You aren't needed here anymore, Dolores. We didn't even prepare a room for you," she continued, "so please leave." Her words hit me like a slap, but I had seen this coming for a long time. I pretended to be shocked, my eyes widening as if this revelation had taken me by surprise. Inside, however, I felt no such shock. I had known that this day was inevitable, and I had mentally prepared myself for it. My husband, Stephen, had already handed me the divorce papers earlier, and I knew he had been waiting for just the right moment to present them. "Here are the divorce papers," he said, his voice filled with triumph. He thrust them towards me, his eyes glittering with satisfaction. "The property will be divided, and I get this house," he added, his tone dripping with arrogance. He looked at me with a smug expression, waiting for me to break down and beg. But I took a deep breath, kept my cool, and calmly accepted the papers with a soft, almost relieved smile. I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, "I'm finally free." The weight of pretending for so long, of acting like everything was fine when it wasn't, had been exhausting. Stephen's eyes widened, and I could see the confusion and disbelief in his expression. He had expected a different reaction, anger, sadness, or desperation. He hadn't expected me to be so calm. I was calm and collected, which threw him off balance. "Why are you acting like this? Aren't you upset? You're being thrown out and losing the house." He snapped, his voice rising as he tried to provoke me. He seemed almost desperate to see me react and break, but I had decided long ago that I would not give him that satisfaction. I had kept my silence for years, but now it was time to reveal the truth. "My name is Dolores. I'm 3. I'm 2 years old. I work as an employee in a company, and I've been married to Stephen for several years. From the moment we got married, I dreamed of building a home together. We lived in a small, rented place, and I saved every penny I could with the hope of one day having a home to call our own." I paused and looked Stephen directly in the eye. "Over time, it became clear to me that you never truly shared that dream, Stephen." My voice was calm, but each word was filled with the truth. Stephen was self-employed in the transportation business and had always kept his finances a mystery. His income was unstable, and although he frequently boasted about how much he earned, claiming it was higher than mine, he never contributed meaningfully to our shared expenses. Whenever I brought up the idea of saving for our future, he would brush me off, using his family as an excuse. He would say that his parents are struggling financially and that he needs to support them, making it sound like he was some kind of hero. His parents lived nearby, and his sister, who also lived with them, often came to visit, which made things even more complicated. His sister, who worked from home, was a constant presence in our lives. She would show up for dinner several times a week, often complaining about what I had prepared. She would say things like, "Is this the same dish as yesterday? I want steak." Her dissatisfaction was evident in her tone. I would come home from work exhausted and prepared dinner, only to have my efforts dismissed, as Stephen never stood up for me. He would simply shrug, as if her complaints were my problem to deal with. He would tell her directly if you have an issue, but he was always so indifferent. It cut me deeper than any of his sister's words. Then came the phone call that changed everything. My brother called to tell me that our father had been rushed to the hospital. He had collapsed at work, and his condition was critical. My mother had passed away years ago, and my father, Probst, he was my last remaining link to my father. Losing him too would have been devastating. I needed Stephen's support, but when I called him, he was cold and distant. He said he was busy and that rushing over wouldn't help. I realized then that I was truly alone. My father's condition remained critical, so I started visiting the hospital every day after work. I wanted to be with my father, but this meant coming home late, which only angered my mother-in-law. I wanted to be by my father's side, but this meant coming home late, which only angered my mother-in-law. She ordered me to come back early one evening. She had no sympathy for my situation and no understanding of what I was going through. It was clear that my visits to the hospital bothered her. She didn't like that I was prioritizing my father over her son and her demands. She even went as far as to suggest that I grow her. She even said I shouldn't bother visiting the hospital so often. She said the nurses would take care of him. Stephen's family kept demanding things, so his parents and sister started coming over for dinner every night. I had to prepare meals for 3 extra people, even though I was exhausted. My mother-in-law never missed an opportunity to criticize my cooking. She always found fault with something I had done. Stephen stayed silent. He never defended me or stood by my side. As time went on, I started to feel more and more resentful towards him. One evening, as I was getting ready to leave for the hospital, my mother-in-law made a snide remark. "Going to the hospital again? It's not like you being there will cure him," she said, in a tone that was dripping with condescension. Her words cut deep, but I chose to ignore her. However, my sister-in-law, who was sitting nearby, laughed and added, "She's probably hoping for a big inheritance by being there all the time." I was so angry. How could they be so heartless? All I wanted was for my father to recover. But they were too selfish to see that despite my prayers, my father passed away a few weeks later. I was devastated. My brother and his wife took care of all the funeral arrangements, allowing me to stay by my father's side until the very end. Stephen, however, never once showed up. Not at the hospital, not at the funeral. When I called him to tell him that my father had, I was shocked by his response. "I didn't care about that. What about dinner? Come home quickly," he said before hanging up. My brother and his wife were furious at his behavior, and I felt nothing but regret for having married him. When I returned home after the funeral, Stephen greeted me with a smile. "Dolores, what did you inherit?" he asked. "I heard your father had a lot of real estate." His eyes gleamed with greed. He hadn't come to the funeral, but now he was eager to know what I had. I glared at him. I was trying to keep my anger in check, but it was hard. "That's none of your business." "And why didn't you come to the funeral?" I demanded. Stephen shrugged. He seemed totally indifferent, which only made me angrier. "I hate funerals," he said. "They're a hassle, but I'd like to know about the inheritance." I told him I hadn't inherited anything, even though I knew that wasn't true. I just didn't want him to know anything. Stephen persisted. He wasn't satisfied with my answer, so he even called my brother to ask about the inheritance. My brother was disgusted by his behavior and called me afterwards. "Dolores, is Stephen really that desperate for money?" I apologized for Stephen's actions, feeling a deep sense of shame after that. My brother and I decided to handle the inheritance without involving Stephen. We agreed on how to divide everything, and I trusted my brother completely. Stephen, however, kept pestering me, asking what I inherited. "Doors don't hide," I told him. One evening, he shouted at me, "What did you inherit? Share it with us." His mother and sister chimed in, "If you inherited the house, share it with us." His sister added, "I'd prefer cash. I want to buy a nice apartment." They were really greedy. I kept my calm and told them I inherited a vacant lot and some cash. "But why should I give it to you?" Stephen's mother and sister frowned, clearly disappointed. Stephen suddenly suggested, "Let's build a duplex on the land. We could all live together. Wouldn't that be great?" His mother and sister were really excited by the idea, so I decided to play along. "Sure, let's build a duplex," I said, pretending to agree. I could see the excitement on their faces, but I was filled with anger. My brother and I had a plan, and I intended to follow through with it. Construction began, and Stephen's family was at the site almost every day, making decisions about the layout and design as if it were their house. I made it clear that I was the one providing the land and the funds, so I would decide the layout. They weren't happy about it, but they had no choice. I chose a stand layout, ensuring that the living areas were separate. My mother-in-law sarcastically remarked, "I'd rather not live with you, Dolores. Dividing the living spaces is better for us." I smiled and responded in a low voice, "Don't worry, we won't be living together." She didn't hear me, but my sister did. My mother-in-law seemed puzzled and asked if I had said something. I denied it, and she let it go as the house neared completion. Stephen and his family started shopping for new furniture and appliances. New houses need new furniture. "Dolores, you should pay for it since it's your house." Stephen suggested trying to make me cover the costs. I pretended to be apologetic. I'm sorry, but my funds are depleted. You'll have to handle the furniture and appliances. I said surprisingly, my mother-in-law agreed with me. Stephen, you can arrange the furniture yourself. Dolores has done enough by building the duplex. She said it was hard not to laugh at her unexpected support. Finally, the day came when the duplex was ready. We went to inspect the new house, and my mother-in-law said with a malicious smile, "Dolores, you aren't needed anymore. We didn't prepare a room for you." Stephen handed me the divorce papers. His sister added, "Stephen is remarrying, so there's no place for you here." They looked at me, expecting me to be devastated, but I smiled. I'm finally free. Why are you acting like this? You're losing everything. I'm not losing anything. Divorcing a man who makes only $999,000 a year and has been unfaithful is the best thing that could happen to me. I could see that my mother-in-law and sister-in-law were getting pretty panicky. They were used to a lot more money coming in each month, after all. My brother arrived just then, so I decided to tell them the truth. I found out about Stephen's affair because my brother had it investigated. I could have divorced him sooner, but I decided to wait for the perfect moment. Stephen tried to deny the affair, but I could see that he was lying. But my brother presented the evidence, and Stephen fell silent. My mother-in-law tried to argue that even if Stephen had cheated, there still needed to be a division of property. She said that this house belonged to Stephen and that the land was inherited from my father, while the funds for construction came from my inheritance. The house is registered in my name, so it's not subject to property division. Stephen and his sister were clearly unsettled, realizing that they would get nothing. Why didn't you tell me? I was told I wouldn't get the house I promised my girlfriend, a life in a new home. Stephen shouted, "I've already bought furniture from my new apartment. Now it's all wasted." I was pleased to see their plans unravel. Stephen was worried about his debts and turned to his sister for support. He asked, "You'll help with the repayments, right?" She turned pale and shook her head. They realized they were in trouble. I remained calm. I told Stephen that I was claiming a division of property and holding his mistress responsible, given that he'd committed adultery. Stephen tried to snatch the divorce papers from me, but my brother intervened. He said it was shameful to try to cancel the divorce after having an affair. My brother said we'd already started the process for a claim through a lawyer, so Stephen finally seemed to understand the seriousness of the situation. He collapsed into a chair, defeated. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law, realizing they had no way to repay their debts, began to beg Dolores, "Please help us. You're the only one we can rely on." My mother-in-law pleaded. I looked at them calmly and said, "We are now strangers. I have no obligation to help you." They were at a loss for words, and my brother and I turned to leave. Suddenly, my usually quiet father-in-law spoke up. "I'm getting a divorce too. I've always followed your mother's commands, but I can't stand it anymore," he said angrily. He left the house, leaving Stephen and his family in shock without my father-in-law's pension, which meant they had no way to pay their debts. I watched them scramble and felt a sense of relief. My brother smiled at me and said everything went as planned. I nodded, grateful for his help. Afterward, I filed the divorce papers and demanded a division of property from Stephen. His affair partner, my father-in-law, ended up getting divorced from my mother-in-law, leaving the family home. Stephen ended up moving back in with his mother after I left. He couldn't afford the rent or living expenses, so they struggled to make ends meet, relying on his mother's pension and his sister's income. His affair partner left him, and he was unwilling to deal with his financial instability. They were stuck with debts they couldn't repay. As for me, I rented. I moved out of the duplex and into a small apartment, using the rental income to live comfortably. Sometimes when I visited my brother and his wife, they would ask if I was thinking about remarrying. I've failed once, and I'm not ready to go through that again. My brother understood, but his wife was optimistic. "Don't worry, Dolores. Next time we'll find someone wonderful for you," she said with a smile. Deep down, I found myself looking forward to whatever the future held.